Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast. Today is, let's see, what is today supposed to be? I think it's supposed to be a Wednesday, but we are marching along with episode 53. This conversation that we're about to have, but if we're going to be measuring it by the pre-show, is one where we'll be engaging in a combination of distinctions and also looking at how we've seen rotations and shifts in broader culture as well as within gun culture. And so, without further ado, I would like you to introduce yourself.
Uh, I am Mike Majewski. I work the marketing side of things at Ferro Concepts, and then I'm a co-founder of Open Source Defense.
Alrighty. And so, I think quite a few people who listen to the show are familiar with Pharaoh. I was reintroduced to them after I stepped away from gun culture for about 4 years. It was interesting to see them just kind of in my world appear out of nowhere. But for you, open source defense, and is that's something you just Google it, you can find
Yeah,
it. It's pretty
yeah.
all right.
The
And
open source name is like a little bit hard, so it's just opensourcedefense.org, where you can find out more about that.
all right, well, we'll get into that in a little bit because I don't want to put too much information out before we talk about what's coming up for Redacted as a whole. If this one is, if I am not mistaken, we are looking at the pre-sale for the skate deck coming out in a matter of days. The skate deck is in conjunction with Orion Training Group, where this is the only one that we're going to be putting out this year. Use it as wall art, use it as a skateboard, but the proceeds of which are going towards the Firearms Policy Coalition to deal with and to address or support any movement against the race ruling on their behalf. So if you want to support the Firearms Policy Coalition, you can head over to redactedllc.com. That's where you'll find our merch. But the skate decks, stay tuned to us on Instagram if you want to know when that's coming out, because it should be, we're looking at kind of a Friday release. Final details are working them out. That's just kind of the nature of what happens when you record the show ahead of release, figuring it out. In addition to that, Season 1, Operation 2 is a go. If you were around during Season 1, Operation 1, you may have received a postcard with a cryptic message integrated. If you have purchased something from the Redacted shop at all during the lifetime of the store, I have your address, which means I have a postcard that I will have probably sent to you by now. If you've not ever purchased anything from us, we are, I guess, still waiting for Subscribe Star to approve our page. But if you want, if we can stay in touch and we can get a postcard your way to start that process. If not, or without further ado, if you want to support the show right now, we're figuring out a couple ways, but the best one is merch, and then we're going to open up a Subscribe Star, which the primary focus is rolling out connectivity between these two ideas. So, Mike, that's enough of me talking about all the things that make this show going, because well, I guess I have to say I am very thankful, and when I say I have to, I mean it's true, and so I have to speak the truth. But we were having this conversation before the show, that, not to leave people in the dark, but where we were kind of doing the, well, this is how I know you, and this is how we got to know each other, and kind of doing the introductory stuff. And it turns out that you're a good example of how I think so much of what happens in what we're referring to as gun culture is very non-standard career paths, quite very different than the 1990s or late 1980s, or that approach to, I'm going to be a fireman when I grow up, and I'm going to be a doctor, and I'm going to go to school and be a doctor. Now we're looking at a very different world. And you were, and before you, was I mistaken in saying that, in hearing that before you got involved with all of the other things that you did in gun culture, you were a college professor for a while?
Yeah, I did that for a while. I was living that adjunct life there for a minute. It was painful at some point, striving between multiple schools, and dealing with that, trying to fight for that like full-time position. I remember some days like driving an hour and a half from one school to the next, uh, which I don't miss at all for a lot of reasons. Um, but yeah, we were talking about kind of some of my experiences in school while I was teaching. I was teaching like a lot of visual communications and design stuff. And I was growing increasingly dissatisfied with um, the students and not fitting in myself because I was like super into guns and I was doing all this, gun related stuff on the side and kind of keeping that a secret too, because that wouldn't fly in an art department, right? Um, but we were talking about trying to train these students to be craftsmen, um, and how difficult that is because of the way we consume information these days. Where, at one point it took hours to produce a photograph, just to take the photo and then go back to the studio, develop the photo out, and it was a very delayed process. But even then, digital images, printing that out on an inkjet printer takes time, takes craftsmanship and skill. Um, that's where we had kind of left it off, right?
Yeah, I have a question about that one because there's a certain sort of reactionary attitude. If you look through, the literature, you could call it. There's elements of the manosphere, the masculinity culture. I'm not talking about Andrew Tate. I'm talking more like Jack Donovan. Because I mean, this is kind of to be short on it. I think Andrew Tate is not interesting. I don't find him a very interesting character. I think some of his I think a lot of the attention that's drawn on him right now is artificial. Is he influential? Certainly, absolutely. But I think there's a certain amount of he's a conveniently controversial enough character where it's easy for everybody to make a point about him. Whereas I think people like Jack Donovan have had a much long lasting or longer influence. Maybe Brett McKay is another example. He runs the Art of Manliness show. So like when people refer to it as the manosphere or like the masculinity culture, one thing that is rather consistent is that the charlatans pretty much get found out quickly. Examples would be like Jack Murphy was a good example. Don't know him very well, but at all, but so in that arena though, there's this there that you occasionally get this that in that arena, and then in another arena of like the men's literature within Christian culture, you very oftentimes get this sort of back when times were good thing. This idea of like back
Yeah,
in the day, people had to work with their hands and they had to till the fields and it built character and and what it is you get sort of like a chronological version of the noble savage, which came around in the late 1800s this sort of the fancy the not the fancification, the glorification of the idea of the noble savage was this idea of like simple, close to earth. Modern version of it would be like the brainless hikey person, who's in touch with themselves. It's like, okay.
yeah. We
This
repeat that cycle too all the time. That
mhm.
that cycle of X thing, like, and I'm not going to turn this into a history of photography podcast, but as a quick note, like when photography hit the scene, um, people one, were viewed it as something that was like pure truthfulness. That a photograph was scientific in nature and needed to be used as such. It
Mhm.
wasn't until like long after that people accepted that it could lie, and that the previous ways were more suited for telling the truth. That's a side tangent on that because it just all of that's happening at the same time, especially that idea of the noble savage is like
Mhm.
happening all around the same time that people are starting to question, well, is the media truthful? Is the people that are writing things and taking photographs, are they telling me the truth?
Mhm.
Um, it's not, all science, right? Um, and there is like that movement of getting back to, because our world goes awry, right, towards the end of the 1800s.
Mhm.
I digress.
No. The reason why I find it extremely interesting, especially in reference to gun culture, is because when we think about gun culture, it's not exclusive from every other element of life. Like it's weird how it's not weird. I think what one of the ways that we see it as an example is that I'm rereading this book, and it's one of my favorites, but I've only read it once in the past. And he's talking about um, one of the paragraphs is talking about the difference between the sacred and the secular, and how in pre postmodern and even pre-modern times, essentially this idea of religion, or what you believe, is sort of baked into every element of your life. Whereas in contemporary life, in the way that we live now, what you believe about the perhaps most important questions and concepts in all of existence are sort of reduced to: what flavor of ice cream do you like? Oh, I'm a blank and a blank too. Oh, I'm an American and a Christian, or I'm a Christian and a gun owner, and I'm a Muslim and a this. And so it's like, it's interesting to see how what we think about as being true, or important even on a metaphysical level, has sort of been cheapened, disenchanted of sorts, to the level of not even aesthetics, but something cheaper than aesthetics. And
Yeah.
so seeing that apply to art, and then how that even that understanding would apply to something like gun culture. And because when the Mandalorian came out, we all made a joke like, guns are a part of my religion. It's like, well, no, that's actually true. Like, I don't
Right.
mean
For sure.
not as a meme, like as a reality. Like, what I believe not entitles, what I believe requires that people have sovereignty or some sort of agency, and that agency is moot if curtailed, or if that if conditions. And thus, by being an individual, I respect you as being a human being, therefore we own guns. Whereas a society that views its people as subhuman be like, well, you're cattle, so no tools for you. So that's enough for me on that
No, yeah.
exciting introduction.
Well,
Craftsmanship.
yeah, that actually what you were just saying kind of goes right into to it was like at the tip of my tongue. I felt like I almost forgot it. But so the idea of craftsmanship that we were kind of talking about before is like lost sometimes in gun culture by this like rapid consumption of media that presents things as a DIY approach. So everything is listed as you can do this at home. You can find all of the information on, you know, how to operate a firearm, how to carry a firearm, how to do all of these things rapidly, extremely rapidly. Um, and you lose that sense of craftsmanship. The great example of this is, you can learn how to dry fire at home, but can you learn how to hold yourself accountable? And would it be better to have a lesson on accountability and a much shorter lesson on how to dry fire? Because of that rapid pace that we're consuming it, we are cheapening something that goes all the way back to these are my views as a person. They are part of my religion, that sovereignty. We're almost like training that at such a rapid pace. And I think what you find is like you get a lot of bad opinions, you get a lot of bad information because it's that rapid rate of it reduces the amount of thought that is required to consume it. And why would you spend the time to do it? I think you watch this. I was talking to Jared at OTG. I was talking to them about this. I I applaud them for opening their curriculum up to civilians.
Hmm.
I applaud it, but it is extremely challenging. I mean, to watch it in person is it's challenging because you have these people that came in, they got into gun culture, they consumed a bunch of media extremely rapidly, and had no talk. No one sat them down and said, "Hey, You need to be accountable. You need to understand what you're doing this for. You need to understand why you're doing it. You need to execute some level of control.
Mhm.
Um, and because we've reduced things so far down, you get these people in these classes where you have somebody like Jared who is fighting that and fighting like, hey, how much information can I condense into 3 days? And fighting these people who, well, they watched it on YouTube as their expert, right? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a character flaw. I mean that's not a it's that's even going back to the idea of or going back to this concept of evaluation of information versus the access to information. Like, there's a certain, let's just say, layer of gun culture which is extremely focused on being right on the internet.
Oh
And
yeah.
and they're very and for whatever intents and purposes it is, there's like I don't want to sound, it's going to sound condescending. There's no way I can say this that isn't going to sound condescending, but what it looks like to me is aimlessness. And that's no abject aim, abject something to to strive for. The only thing that a section of the population is left with is producing a false hierarchy of information that is important but not relevant to them. Maybe, well, relevant but not evaluated. There's a word that I'm looking for that I can't figure it out exactly. Um, and I usually do that like once a show, where I just don't remember a word I'm looking for. But this is different. I actually just don't know what word to use on this one. So that's why I know it's going to sound condescending. Like it sounds condescending in the same way that a wizened professor says, "You will grow out of this." Like, you will either mature out of this issue, or it will destroy you. And I know that it sounds condescending, and that's just kind of the way that it has to be right now. And I hope that it isn't so off-putting that it would create a new rift within gun culture. But there is a certain element of like this need to be validated as being correct on the internet is part of that problem. Whereas,
Absolutely.
and part of that problem is that like I'm willing to bet that the person who is in that state is in a state of sort of aimlessness. They're not entirely sure where they're going at.
Well,
So,
I think that there's I mean, this could be getting too basic on or over analyzing, but there is the whole act of going out and buying a gun and the empowerment that that starts you out with.
mhm,
Because in theory, right, you have this device that its feature is that it can kill people. That's its feature. It's not a flaw.
mhm,
Um, so you have this. You go out. You get this device. You have taken um, control in that moment, whether it's true or not. You've taken some level of control over a part of your life. So when you start with something that's like up here on in terms of like actions people are doing on a daily basis, dude, that's
mhm.
like your everyday life is here. Like buying a gun's like up here in terms of ways that you can solidify like your personal security, right? So that's extremely empowering. You're taking that energy and bringing it onto the internet, right?
Mhm.
And I'm not saying people, you know, funnel that in the right ways because they obviously don't very often. And I also don't think it's wrong. What you were saying is like that's not really condescending. To me, it's just honest, right? I mean, sometimes it's okay to condescend somebody.
It has its point, right? It has its place. And so because I think of like this has been kind of a construction that's come up multiple times, but one of the things that I found out, and this is personal experience, is that I was basically using the military for a while as a surrogacy for having an aim in life. Didn't know, so like for example, and this is kind of how it played out, is that basically as soon as like I grew up in rural Minnesota, and before I left for the military, I was like 150 pounds, did not play sports, did not play any football, didn't have any interest in the social. I was homeschooled. I didn't have I had a social life is probably the best way to say it, but it was people that I actually knew, like friends that I had chosen to make friends with. So there was a little bit more deliberate nature in the friendships. It wasn't like I was in class with them every day. So I left for the military, and basically I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know if I wanted to go to college for what. I had the ideas of, like, playing in a band and going to school for this, and like the when I was I had started college at 16 because you can do that in Minnesota, and like all of the best subjects that I performed in were all art subjects, but I didn't know where I wanted to go. I was thinking about music school. I was like, none of this makes sense to me. So when I decided to join the military, to some people, it was a surprise. To my family and my friends, it wasn't. But I was like, I'm going to go join the military. I'm going to go do special operations. I'm going to be special forces. That's all I knew, right? And so I did, except for special forces. The door was closed to me because I wasn't old enough. So I ended up going into a Ranger battalion. And so for a period of time, I basically said, RIP is my purpose in life, RIP Ranger Indoctrination Program. And that's all that matters to me. And so I surrogated having an aim, or I set my aim pretty short in the grand scheme of time. And when I graduated, I had no idea. When I actually passed RIP, which there's another story and baked into that cake, kind of didn't know. Like, I was kind of left in a morass of like, what do like, I'm stuck in Georgia now. I thought I was going to be stationed in Lewis, and this is not cool and weird. And so there was a period of depression. And it's interesting that, so I kind of lost interest in so much of what we would refer to as gun culture. While I was in Ranger Battalion, I was not interested in guns and stuff. I was doing other stuff or whatever. And then, but the one thing that the one advantage that military and to some extent law enforcement have is that they have a mission that they're focused on, generally speaking.
Mhm.
Whereas gun culture, like, for example, there was no, you didn't need to validate to me in Ranger Battalion why I needed to learn how to do CQB. That was already answered because I knew I was going to go on another deployment in a couple more days or weeks or whatever. And it's likely that it was going to be in an urban environment. So like all of that information was justified. It was just the how. The only thing that I had to learn how to do was the how, never the why. And now people like Jared are teaching the how, which is I think we just say is a good thing. Like, it's fantastic that
Right.
he's teaching it to open enrollment. But that does not always answer the why. The why being for each individual is going to change from person to person to some extent. And that the why would you learn how to do this is very different, is not as easily provided as somebody who who their occupation involves doing CQB. And it may be a difficult question to answer, but that doesn't mean it can't be answered.
Yeah. And I'm like constantly awestruck when I because of open source defense, I meet a lot of um, gun owners that I don't normally think about.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went to that OTG class, when I've seen like content from them, I see a lot of gun owners that I don't normally think about because the context of me is like I'm at Ferro Concepts. I'm selling gear to military, to special operations, to law enforcement, to civilians that are already they've already passed a certain mark. They already know that they need the tactical, the body armor. I don't have to really explain that to them because they're already there. So I'm watching, these people who are really new to this diving into topics that 5 years ago you would have never dove into. And there is a shift that's happening of in gun culture that is, and I would be curious to kind of figure out what's driving it, but you're watching like a lot more focus on fitness. You're watching a lot more focus on, hey, like you should learn how to do CQB or you should learn how to shoot 600 yards away. Hey, you need to think about these things. And you know, I'm sure some of that is driven by marketing teams that are out there trying to get people to buy the next gun, and that next gun encourages certain tactics. But I think it's surpassed that, right? It's almost like it's and I don't know if like there's parallels to other industries, but maybe it's that rapid reach at information. I don't know what it is, but like you're seeing such pointed topics that would normally push people away, but you're watching these people that are just taking it in. I mean,
Mhm.
they're like thinking you have a guy that is like a gas station attendant, and he's thinking about like, wow, how will I filter water when the power goes down? How, what how am I gonna buy a PVS 14? Those are crazy topics.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, the
you
idea of
know,
spending like 8 to $15,000 on a set of night vision, and I'm not even talking about 14s, which are like what 3,000 ish. Like the idea of going, oh, I'm going to spend $10,000 on an item that is not relevant to my work immediately.
but why is it going that way,
There
right?
are, I mean, I have a series of, let's just do it. Let's do this academically. I have a series of hunches. I have a series
Okay.
of hunches, and that's about how I can answer. Like, why is it going this way? Well, what is this way? It's the individual, the capabilities of the individual are suddenly front and center, primary interest number one. Those capabilities include logistics capabilities or equipment and skill sets and general conditioning, let's just say. Fitness makes sense in one sense, and perhaps I think in perhaps it's a little bit of the pendulum swing of the opulence of the boomers. It's just a pendulum in that sense of
Right.
like, there I don't many of us grew up knowing which families that it was where the television was on all the time. I don't know if that's universal, but there was a pretty solid distinction when I look back on my childhood. I know that family because they go, the kids come to school and they literally sit in front of the television until they go to bed. Or the parents get home from work and that television is always on and there's always somebody sitting and watching it. So like that was an example of a distinction. Whereas I knew other families where that wasn't the case. And maybe that was my example, but so maybe the fitness has a little bit of a pendulum swing. Maybe a little bit more of it is it's a little bit more accessible. Maybe it's partially driven by the sense that hookup culture has moved from the bar to the gym. I'm not sure in all of these things, but um as far as guns and individual capacity, there are certainly influences. Like I can even laugh at myself. There's a new Call of Duty. The Call of Duty's new season just dropped. One of the weapons is basically a one of the new weapons is basically a B&T APC 5.56. I have one. I haven't shot it in probably a year. The new expansion comes out. I just built out my APC for whatever. Is it practical to the environment that I'm living in? Not really. But like that's an influence. Another one is we're seeing a cultural decrease, a cultural loss of trust in government and institutions. Whether that's 2020, whether that's political, whether that's apolitical, the overall question is that there's less trust in at least Washington, D.C. level politics. There's more interest in local politics, more interest in local participation, more interest in decentralization. That is a good thing. But it's also coming about somewhat naturally. Like, yeah, sure, we can talk about the collapse of Western civilization and all this kind of stuff. But one part that's coming out of it is those who decentralize are decentralizing. They're using that is their opportunity. I think access to information is forcing people to sort of try to figure out how they evaluate all of this information now, and all of these things are compiling into, it's not just 2020 riots that motivated gun culture. It's not just the desegregation of social elements. I wouldn't even I mean, it's weirdly artificial. It's not just politics. It's not just social media influence. It's not just entertainment and video games. It's just all of these things are happening at the same time, and it's hard to pinpoint how much of it is connected.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I think like, people always laugh and they'll be like, well, you know, what why do you want to own a gun? You get asked that, or like from somebody who doesn't understand. And there's been a few times, like, just to kind of see what somebody says, I'll just say like, well, it can boil down to like, I don't want to be told I can't, right? I don't
Mhm.
want to be told that I can't have that, on a very basic level. And I think about like the expression of individuality that's wrapped up in that. And it's weird because like we have all these stereotypes of what we think a gun owner is, but we do that back to that sovereign person idea. I think that people have been so hammered with notions that are devoid of individuality, um, in the mainstream, right? And then those people kind of start falling, out of that mainstream and are kind of looking at it from a bird's eye view and are saying like, well, man, I don't even fit into that, and I'm okay with it because I found a group of people that are cool with me not fitting into it. Um, and at like that basic level of like, okay, I have this item that empowers me, protects me, ensures my individuality as a person. And we're not saying like, oh, I disagree with you, I'm going to point my gun at you. We're saying like, the individuality is wrapped into that being sovereign, right? And that ability to, um, if you're let's say like in a militia or something like that, you're still an individual within that militia, and you found a group of people that express acceptance, some level of acceptance, or you wouldn't be there, right? They would boot you. It's just like, really interesting to think about because contrasting that with what I view on social media every day in gun culture.
What do you think about this thing? And it seems like there's two concepts in tension right now. One of them is culturally speaking, not just gun culture, but America and the West is dealing with the problem of atomization, which is in one part driven by society's values, meta value, or values, not metas, but just values, like what individuality. If individualism and individuality um prioritized excessively, it produces atomization. Atomization means like everyone's lonely, kind of thing. Not lonely like I feel lonely, but there's everyone's individual and disconnected, and they don't have any, you know, no community, no culture, whatever. But
Yeah.
you've got, on the one hand, you've got the West dealing with cultural, or with atomization. Um and then, which is contrasted by anyone who's a part of anything, or which is in tension with this idea of being connected to something, and being ingrained in a community and in a culture and in a neighborhood and in a, in having common language and common values, and having common ideas. And so, while even especially men are dealing with this idea of being atomized, which is partly driven by technology, partly driven by social milieu, partly driven by politics, partly driven by things like, are the divisiveness of politics, or things like events like the pandemic. Um, so, you've got internal influences, technology, internal influences. Um, there's less of a focus on courage, more of a focus on expression or whatever. And now, so that is exemplified and in contrast with the word that you use, militia. Like, oh, I'm involved with a bunch of, I go I have a I'm involved with a batch of citizens who would be described as a militia by my detractors, by our own position, and how like you can go and do anything you want with any group of people as long as it doesn't involve guns, because then it's bad. Is kind of what I'm
Yeah.
trying to get to, right? Like there is the LGBT community. It's like, like the only thing that we have in common is we have abnormal or atypical sexual preferences, or whatever the word is appropriate for the day. It's like, does that make you a community? Ours is we have a collection of values. Does that make you a community? It's Christian community. Is that we all attend the same church? Does that make you a community? So it's the point that I'm saying is that like the atomization is killing people quite literally with suicide, and so
Oh
people
yeah.
are reaching out to each other to get integrated into a community, whether it's as real as their neighborhood or as distant as some sort of disparate online thing, and they're vehemently condemned because that community has anything to do with guns.
Yeah. I, and this reminds me of there's some parallels to this. Substack. I forget what her name is. There was a great thread on Twitter um, where she was talking about she works at Substack. She was talking about what happens when you censor things on the internet, um, and when you moderate for truth, you end up censoring a whole lot of people. And so the idea is that if you're in the bar and every day somebody runs, at least one person's going to come in and run their mouth, you walk up to that person and say, "Hey, you got to go to Bob's bar down the street." And every day somebody new comes in, they run their mouth, and you say, "You got to go to Bob's bar down the street." You say
Mhm.
that every single day. Well, suddenly you're going to have a bunch of people in Bob's bar that have the same thought. They're really angry, and you've sequestered them out of the public, and they're gonna go a couple directions with that. The people at Bob's bar, but basically, like, because we are viewed, as this group of people that are really angry with guns, um, you know, it becomes like this very angry subsection, because they've been forced to go to Bob's bar. They didn't want to go there in the first place,
I, I,
but now they're over there and they're yeah.
I think it's fair to state. I think it's fair and ethical and not hyperbolic to say that gun culture is persecuted in the United States.
Oh yeah, and well, you know what though, that the contrast to that, the contrast to that is that there's 420 million of these guns out there.
It's
So
I mean, you have government persecution, tech censorship persecution.
for sure.
You have the idea that it's that like you said, like the idea that it's in academia, it's considered, oh, you can't talk about that because it's bad, right?
Oh, for sure.
You know what I mean? So I'm saying like, and when I mean persecution, I don't mean this in like the political sense of like we're oppressed. No, I just mean it's cultural. There is active movement, but that's different. The action of persecution, like with your the way that you're talking about it, is different than the kind of the wash off, what that impact is. It wouldn't be as effective if the mouthwash of it didn't work. I'm trying to find the word. Um, you mean like if, but it like the stigma, the social stigma, right? It's
Yeah,
it's like a legitimate social stigma. I understand it. And it changes from place to place. There are certain parts of the country and certain areas and environments where it's not unusual, but that's called appropriateness. But the
right.
Bob's Bar thing, going back to your Bob's Bar metaphor or example, thought experiment, is everyone with a certain opinion has been sequestered to Bob's Bar, and now they're gonna go do something, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
And I think like you do a couple things when that happens. When you put them at Bob's bar, they become out of view of everybody, and they become the person at Substack was saying is that basically when you sequester people, you remove them from scrutiny amongst the general population because you've sequestered them. So they can openly discuss at Bob's bar, but nobody's there to ask any questions about that, right? And so the idea was that we should stop banning people and that we should ridicule them for having, you know, whatever we should either ridicule or scrutinize or question, whatever that may be. And
Mhm.
sometimes I think about that, like with gun culture, and these like very, you very oftentimes see very staunch beliefs that have no, they're presented in a way that doesn't allow criticism, and a lot of it comes back to what you're talking about, that persecution where you can't bring that up in public. You have to be careful who you talk to about that.
Mhm.
uh, and we're almost, it's funny too because it's such a massive amount of people that
It's
are
all
that are gun owners.
it's also a serious topic though. Like, there's humor embedded in gun culture, or you can even take like military stuff. Is that like everyone, people in the it's not we know that people in the military tend to have like a dark sense of humor of like,
Mhm.
jokes aside, like there's always jokes that are always like we've got a prosthetic for that kind of thing, right? We've got a great prosthetic for that, or something where you're like, really?
Yeah.
It's funny, but I don't wanna laugh. Jokes like that, but like the dark humor thing, or like, you look at memes and like the "I accept your terms" thing and all of this kind of stuff, right? But, what I'm saying what that like, what you can see in gun culture as a whole being oh, no, I'm doing the tip of your tongue, watching the train leave the station, thought thing happening too, like, "No." Um But where were you? You were saying something. I need to put it back together. I'm sorry. I lost the whole thing. The train left the station mid
No,
thought.
you're good.
Um,
The thing that I think about all the time is culture being stuck in Bob's bar.
yes. Yes. And so like it's the same issue of like and I think of this one as very interestingly with like the kind of the whole idea of like the neo-Nazis or the white supremacists or the whatever it is, right? Like, if you the because this ideology has been not ideology, but because anything that could possibly be considered a whiff and a hint of this subject is immediately like scrubbed from a social conversation, anyone who holds those kind of beliefs, they tend to coalesce in this, in the dark corners of the internet. And I mean, there's one part of me that agrees with her Substack in the sense of this because I have heard it before. I just don't remember who wrote it. I gotta go back into it. But the other side of it too is like that's gonna happen anyway because like if you there's a certain amount of sense in culture where I will argue this is based on I recognize this based on an assumption. I believe that people have a conscience, that they have a conscience. That conscience is part of being human. And because they have a conscience and that conscience informs them that what they're arguing for or doing is wrong, some people will try to snuff out their conscience and collect and surround themselves with people who don't challenge, don't function culturally as that conscience. They'll surround themselves with people who put up with their garbage, for lack of better words. And so like there's a certain element within culture as a whole that is going to seek out people of their same proclivities, and whether or not you censor them is not going to matter. And a really good example I think of this one would be somebody like Epstein. But more importantly, within gun culture, within gun culture as well as within culture as a whole, or America or the West or whatever, I have another idea that might be in tangent to that part of tangent, as not tangent off the track, but in line with that. And that is, there was a philosopher, I think is a forgot her name, but there's a philosopher in the 1900s who spent a decent amount of her time talking about how the more that you control a person or population, the more controls, the less agency individuals are given, the more likely they are to lash out in violence. And a basic level of agency is communication. And so when you take a person and you put them and you continuously artificially force them out of participation, let's just say force them to the fringes of society, and then they become it increases their likelihood to commit violence. And quite literally, it's when you try to induce gun control, you produce the environment which encourages violence. The act of trying to control a population is the very same act. The act of voting for gun control is this very same act as arming the school shooter. You are putting things into you're building your society in such a way where the only form of free expression it's not even free expression, is the only position that people are in is violence. And this is exactly what you get out of like the punk movement. This is sort of the milieu behind the cyberpunk concept, not milieu, this idea that's behind like the cyberpunk concept is that society has become so totalitarian that none of it matters but violence. And so like these are, in deeply ingrained ideas. But I think with the example of like social media, if you take away people's agency, you dehumanize them, and therefore, and which produces, you're not responsible for the violence that they do, but it does motivate the outcome.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting idea too to consider, think about the perspective that we're talking about this from, that we are talking about gun culture or gun community or whatever you want to call it is sequestered away in this like box, and they belong over here, and we, kind of bleep them out of conversations or this or that. It's interesting to me if you think about the number of gun owners, the number of people that have a gun and are happy about owning a gun, and they're not afraid to admit it, is actually, it's pretty high. Like they're ubiquitous in that, like, 7 in 10 Americans have shot a gun before. Like that's an astronomical number, and we own an astronomical amount of firearms, over 400 million of them. There are very few other things that I think I could name off the top of my head that are that ubiquitous, but then also that aggressively pushed completely out of the picture. And if they are brought up, it's usually in a negative light or in a light that is, gun rights is losing. Because if you put it in perspective, compared to like 1990 to 2023, more states have constitutional carry than states that don't have constitutional carry.
Yes.
I mean, it is like, I'm trying to even draw a parallel in my own head of something that is that ubiquitous, but that that controversial, right? You see, it doesn't usually add up in people's heads. And I always think about the like gun culture always coming from this standpoint of losing. Realistically, gun culture, gun rights has kind of done nothing but win for the past 15 plus years in so many ways, right?
Like when you bring up constitutional carry, you're absolutely correct. I think, yeah, I mean, like for example, I moved states, and then the new state that I live in is a constitutional carry state. It's awesome. And the short answer of that is it's awesome. It's just that's all it is. It's nice
Right.
that I live in an environment where I don't have to. I'm not. And so now when I move around, if I travel around the country, the attitude is different. It's like, wow, I actually have to like get a permit to have a gun here. I actually have to do things like it's very strange. But um, sorry, so there are victories to be had. I think, but then at the same time, it's weird because, like you say, it's sort of vehemently attacked for being so ubiquitous. I would agree with you. Um, I got to think about that a little bit.
Yeah,
I,
it's a challenging one in a lot of ways, and I think does come back to that. Yeah, it's ubiquitous, and that it's you approach other people. You buy a new car, you tell them you bought it. You tell a new friend, "Oh, I just bought a new car. It's great." Well, you don't tell people you bought a new gun. I mean, obviously, your gun toting friends, you tell them that, but when it's as popular and as ubiquitous as it is, it's the contrast is weird, right? The it's hard.
yeah, there is. I think there's one part of it that's natural and one part of it that's unnatural. The natural part of it is, when you say I've added this capacity to myself through acquisition of items and implied some sense of skill set development or whatever, it kind of returns to the question, to what aim? Like, in some sense, there is that question of like, why would you do that? Like, why would you dedicate time and energy to producing to such a thing? And I understand it, and which is where, like, you see the cultural aspect, the cultural presentation of, oh, people need to get a new hobby. Guns is just a bad hobby. It's like, you know, this is an example of, it's not a steel man version of the argument, but it is an example of it. It's that, like, part of the culture views it as a hobby, and then part of the culture views it as something much more important. So there is that part. I think part of it is that gun culture has accepted the shame.
Yeah,
They've accepted the shame. Like,
big time.
we've accepted it. Like, we've accepted the shame in the same way that we're like, well, I'm a responsible gun owner. But I think the other side of it too is, like, we genuinely feel bad for bad things that happen, and that's
Oh, for sure.
it's preyed upon all the time. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like, again, it's somehow gun owners is like a caste and a class of people in our society that are somehow culpable for the actions of people we have never even knew existed, right? I look at it, like, you look at it in, like, how you see, like, cultural elements. um Gun culture is sort of held, or people who own guns are held responsible for the acts of every person who commits an atrocity. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? But, like, but at the same time, it's like, well, we don't start throwing bricks at the houses of pharmacists every time there's a negative, effect of a drug, or there is a we don't start. I mean, there are examples of it, but, like, we're smart enough to realize that, just because you ran into a bad lawyer doesn't mean that every lawyer in the world is a scumbag. And
right.
and those are occupations. Every person that's interested in knitting is not the same person, and that's a hobby. But what we so and so and but and again, we're looking at guns as, it's not necessarily a profession for most people, and it's not a hobby. It's just not I mean, some people it's a hobby. I
The
get it.
majority of them, it's not a hobby. You are 100% right on that.
The people's motives for becoming self-sufficient is not the same as a hobby. A hobby is picking up. I mean, this is why it's a difficult transition too, because there are people who are hobbyists, in the sense of, like, they're never going to really participate in certain things, but they're going to collect, and they have all this whatever, right? It's a weird gray area.
For
But
sure.
But I think the cruel irony of it is most people purchase a gun because they have the desire to take personal responsibility over themselves, and they are somehow derided as if they were doing the very opposite.
Oh yeah,
You
and
know,
the other like challenging thing to tell people is like, well, we live in this like kind of bubble of like, well, things shouldn't have consequences, right? So you drink a diet coke, well, it doesn't have consequences because it doesn't have sugar in it, so I don't have to worry about gaining weight from drinking 10 of these diet cokes a day. That's what they want to convince you of. And the reality is this, is that personal freedoms have consequences. They always will. It doesn't matter. One of those consequences is that somebody is going to take that tool, and they're going to use it maliciously, and that's going to happen. And I have to come from an honest standpoint as somebody who says, hey, like, I want to own guns. It's important to me. It's important to my morally, it's important to me.
mm-hmm.
I accept that people are going to die from this.
Yes,
People will lose their lives, and I you have to, of course, like, you could simplify it. You could simplify it as down to saying I'm okay with that, but that's not, doesn't do it justice. It hurts. Like, consequences hurt. That I don't like that, but I'm willing to weigh the pros and cons of that and say I accept it. I accept it. I'm not okay with it, but I accept it. It's worth it.
so I think another way that it comes out to is there's a cruel irony in the idea of like, these are, it's really, I got to be careful. We should probably move off of these because I feel like it's just going to end up in a spiral of like basically Twitter level responses, you
For
know.
sure.
And like, and a good example is that, there was this Michigan State University shooting that just happened, which immediately got memory hold because of the supposed identity and tool of the shooter or whatever, right? It was like, and again, it's like, it's so indicative. It's so
Mhm.
obviously indicative. It was Sam Hyde did it. If you get the meme, but,
Yeah.
like, you know what I mean? It was like, and that's what it was for a while, and then, obviously a whole bunch of people got fooled by that. But then as soon as it was like, "Oh, yeah, the guy who did the thing wasn't who they want, it didn't fit the convenient narrative," it was gone. Just,
Yep.
completely, it just, now it's just back to generic talking points. And but one of the elements of this was this idea of like, guns is, you should get a different hobby. Well, we've addressed that problem. The other one is, gun people are sick because they can't live without them. And it's like, it's interesting, and this is where I think I am representing it poorly, but this is what I think gun culture is doing, is it's recognizing that the arguments should not be dictated by the least of us. And when somebody makes a statement like that, "Oh my God, you're so sick, you can't live without a gun." It's like, it's I'm not really too concerned about answering that as absolving that person's conflict. Rather, I think we've come to realize that a light, the liberty within a population to own a firearm is in some sense an element of agency, individual agency. Absent that agency, they're not a population. They're a plantation of some sort, where you're kind of reducing people to the level of automatons, and it's just a life not worth living is probably the way of saying it. Like, it's not the gun that is the thing. It's that a life where I don't have agency is not worth living is probably a way that it would be worth. It's getting down rooted into it, because I don't, and this is the one of the best parts about gun cultures is we're getting wiser about this. We're getting more ingrained in it. We're getting more focused on it. We're like, it's not that, Erd or McGurd or Turk and McGurns. It's not that simple. It's quite simply, or it's not that simple. It's much more aligned with, like, it's not the gun. I don't care if you take my AR-15 because I have one. I don't care if you take that. I care if you dehumanize me to the level of a serf, where I am not even where your attitude as some sort of regent or whatever your job is or your title is or your attitude is effectively saying you on the street who think this way are reducing me to the level of a dog because you don't think humans have that capability. And maybe the answer is you don't. Not you and me, but the accuser
Right.
does not and has to impose that frailty on the world. And so that's kind of where it's been coming out of it. Like, I know that there's a lot of like defense, but the other side of gun culture, which I'm kind of interested in your opinion on it too, is that we kind of don't care anymore. Look at the brace ruling.
Oh, for sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, I guess, short barreled rifles aren't on the NFA anymore. I mean, they are, but they might as well not be at this point. Oh
That was
no.
crazy noise out there. So yeah, so
Oh no,
that.
I swatted you while you were talking to me.
Oh no. You're good. You're good.
I'm kidding.
I was like, dude, what? Did I hear like a trash can full of tannerite go off? Just kidding.
Are you in Ohio? Have the aliens come to get you?
Dude, yeah, I was born and raised in Ohio, and luckily I'm not there anymore.
Ah,
But yeah, the civil disobedience. I think like people will do it. It's gonna be interesting because you're gonna have a group of people who you're gonna have a large group of people who are stuck with these pistols right now and don't know what to do with them. And the easiest solution is to just put a stock, leave the pistol brace on it, right? And or go out and buy a stock. That's the easiest solution. Realistically, ATF doesn't have a track record of arresting people for that. I know that they have. Usually, it doesn't go anywhere, but I think that's where most people are just going to be pretty apathetic, and they're just going to say, "Well, I mean, I'm not going to figure out how to converse with the ATF. That's hard, and it is convoluted. In their defense, it is a convoluted process. So that's interesting that you have civil disobedience stemming from apathy. Is an interesting one. Another one is people who never had pistol braces to begin with. They didn't care, and were really loud about it. And then you'll have another group of people who are just going to quietly stop posting photos of guns on the internet.
mhm.
Which is also, they all have their merits, and I understand. I frankly kind of like the problem that the ATF created. They do this a lot. And this is not the first. The pistol brace is probably the biggest in terms of like consequence, but it's funny to me. You know, what did they? I can't remember the number of pistol braces that are out there. It's some ludicrous number where it's like in the millions, right?
Yeah, there's two sets of numbers. The ATF is said something more between 3 and 7 million, whereas the industry says somewhere between 10 and 40. So
Yeah.
like
So
like conservatively, we're looking. My opinion, we're definitely looking at about 10. Like I
there's
pretty conservatively 10 to 13.
in Montana, there are two ATF agents. I think they just hired two more. So I think there might be four now. In Washington State, it's a similar number. Oregon is a similar number. This is literally impossible to enforce. I think the bigger problem is that I think some people will either rat themselves out or you'll have the ATF. What I suspect is going to happen is, well, one, if let's say this doesn't get overturned, let's say we live in a world where pistol braces are really banned. I think you'll see the ATF start making, they'll showcase somebody that they
They'll make
arrested.
examples, yeah.
But you do need to sit back and remember there are way less ATF agents than you think there are.
Mhm.
Like, they are not numerous. In a lot of states, there's only a couple. You couldn't possibly ever enforce this.
It's like I mean, the rote tyranny of it is it's so Soviet. I don't if and I, let me explain. Let me explain. It's so Soviet. So I went over to Ukraine for a little bit with a camera just to kind of see what was going on. This was last year, and and there were other circumstances involved in it, but whatever, it doesn't matter. Nothing cool, right? Let's just had a camera. I was a journalist at the time, so great. Um, and one of the things I was kind of visiting smaller villages and trying to figure out things like, you know, what is actually what aid is actually coming here, what is just being gobbled up by corruption, what, is like, is this a real organization, are they is their GoFundMe a real thing, these kind of questions, right? Just kind of like doing like and trying to see what like the world's reaction to something like this would be. And it's interesting. So you could almost say that you could almost condemn me with the same Malcolm Nance level problems, but I didn't write a book on genociding the American population, so oops.
Oops.
Don't quote me on that one, but actually, but on that point, the point is, there was this thing that I saw in some of the small villages where you could see the ghost of communism hanging over the population. And what that looked like and this is what I'm saying it's so Soviet with the ATF, is that when it comes to what you're talking about with the ATF, let's just take the state of Montana. You have easily over 100,000 gun owners, probably with braces in the state of Montana, right?
For sure.
And you have two agents. The odds are not in their favor,
No.
right? But of those 100,000 people, it appears like all of them have enough moral conscience to not go out and do something foolish and wicked.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of
Hmm.
self-explanatory.
Yeah.
But at the same time, each one of those 100,000 people is now at the jeopardy of being the one that those two agents could target. And so as a
Right.
result, the 100,000 all kind of go along with the dictum of the two. And so that's the Soviet tyranny of it, is that no one, and for rightly so, and I'm saying this is moral, you should not flippantly talk about violence, especially in your own country, with the casualness of saying, with the brashness of being a drunk, except even when you're sober. That is not good. But I'm not saying but as in like, well, I support the Second Amendment, but I mean this in the state of, but the environment, and in conjunction with that, the environment we live in is the tyranny of the few over the many. And
Yeah. And
so it is a serious question with the organization of the ATF, because culturally speaking, we're absolutely winning. Absolutely winning. Gun culture is absolutely winning because gun culture is rerooting itself into Americana. Whereas the legislation and the non-legislation moves by the ATF are clearly the objectives of despots.
yeah,
So it's
you
effective.
know, it's also funny too when you talk about like legislative things. So being rooted in Americana, that's interesting because think about how big of a topic it is when you compare like how often you hear about uh you know gun laws or whatever it may be. The amount of lobbying for the firearms industry is pretty nil compared to almost any other industry. In fact, the gun industry as a whole, in terms of like revenue,
Mhm.
is like microscopic. Like it is not what people think it is.
Mhm.
Um, and it's funny because like you really are dealing with just extremely vocal people. The lobbying efforts aren't there. I mean, I know that the left would want you to believe otherwise, that the NRA is this giant monster of a lobbying, but they're not. They never, the NRA didn't need Well, of course they needed money for private jets and suits, but they didn't need the money for lobbying. Their base was already so angry uh, that they could just scream it away. It's an interesting idea because there's not, you don't have people screaming about oil and gas, right? But that
You
lobbying
don't
is huge.
well, yeah, I mean, that lobbying is huge. I mean, it's, the Grammys, or the Oscars or whatever is brought to you by Pfizer. It's you know what I mean? Like, what is
Yeah,
it? Like, I'm pretty sure Pfizer made $100 billion last year, or from the pandemic, you know what I mean? Like, in profit. That's, whatever, that's what it's been said. But it doesn't matter. Like, this is not about the vaccine, or this is not about COVID, or whatever anything has to do with that. It has to do with, you're absolutely correct, and I understand. I agree with you, and you're absolutely correct in the lobbying capacity and dollar value measurement of what you would refer to as gun culture or the gun industry is extremely small. I think for most people in gun culture, that's obvious. For people who are outside of gun culture, I don't know.
oh,
Because
it's not obvious to them at all.
well, I mean, I agree with you that it's not obvious, but part of
For
me
the
want
people outside of it is
yeah.
what I
But now this is where I'd be interested in your kind of where you're coming at from, even the open source defense side, where um you have I'm looking for perspective in a question I don't know how to answer. And the answer is, that person who believes that the gun lobby is huge, are they even real? Like, are they, and I don't mean this like physically, like, there's an example of people who are, like, let's just use Twitter as an example. There are certain characters who are prominent, very loud voices for a certain, of certain, of let's just call it the left right now. Um, and at times what they say is so strange that I'm not even sure if they're real people. Like, and I mean this in the sense of, like, that is so counterfactual to reality. Part of me wonders if it's a fake profile, or if it's like an artificially produced individual. Not like it's an AI, but like it's a fake influencer. You know what I mean? Like, if it's almost, it's like, maybe this is a little conspiratorial or suspicious, but there are certain characters where it's like, I'm not I'm is this a bot? Because,
you're not wrong for asking that.
like, is this a functional, is it an actual bot? Like, well, it's
Yeah,
actually just an AI generated personality. Or some of them are things where, like, like, it's like, well, such and such with 1 point or 2.7 million followers or whatever like that. It's like, the gun lobby, the blood is on the hands of all gun owners, and you're like, why would you even say that? That's not a thing that that's not a thing that an intellectual person, an intelligent person would say, right? And so,
right.
like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, it's like, if that's your opinion, I can't help. I don't know. I'm stuck in this ethical question of being, I mean, responding, is whatever, but it's sort of like, that's not an intelligent take on
Yeah.
anything that's going on. And so I struggle with this idea of, like, well, is this person even real? Now,
Oh, yeah. I,
so in response to, like, culture as a whole, right? You and I know, most of the people who I would imagine almost everyone listening to this show knows, that the gun industry's lobbying capacity is like dwarfed. It's like 1% of just Planned Parenthood. It's
for
like,
sure.
you know what I mean? And that's a political subject. Anything that has to do with lobbying will be political. I don't It doesn't need to be a left versus right, up versus down thing, but
Or
it
just
does.
talk numbers.
But just in numbers, like, so most everyone who's listening to the show, or anyone who's involved in gun culture enough to even listen to a podcast on gun culture, is probably going to know that the lobbying capacity of gun industry is really small. Okay, that's true. And yet we have, what is it? You said 7 in 10 people in America own guns. Then where
Or
is this
have
coming
shot
from?
one.
Or have shot one. That's right.
And
It's like,
and I don't. Yeah. This all reminds me of an interaction where, like, you're asking, like, do you know these people? And I was like, right before I moved to Montana, it was maybe a couple months before I quit my last job. Um, one of my really close friends was dating a girl who was pretty liberal, and we're sitting around the campfire, and she's a public school teacher, and obviously when you're starting out in public school teaching, you have no money. And I was working at this holster company at the time, a really pretty big holster company, and I tell her, I'm like, hey, well, she's telling me about how she was like trying to drive Uber and like doing all this stuff. And I was like, hey, well, like if you just need a summer job, like I can get you a job at my company in production where you're just like screwing holsters together or something like that. It's pretty chill, and no one really talks politics. I know you don't like the gun stuff. No one talks politics. They just work, listen to a podcast all day. And she was like, she, and I was like, it at the time, I think they were starting out at like some high wage that was way above the norm. And she's like, no, I would never work for somebody whose company owners probably donate to Republican political causes. And the funny part was, little did she know, is like the company owners that I worked for at the time were like, they would never they would never donate money to political causes. That was like, they were like pretty staunchly against that. And they just thought politicians were just interfering with them making money, which is funny, but and probably true. And she just turns around with this amount of like vitriol about it. When I was just trying to be nice, of like, hey, like don't drive Uber, like come work where I work. It's pretty cool. You relax. She like basically never talked to me after that ever again. And she's also it's just one of those things where you do wonder like how can you have these views? It's like almost back to this AI bot. Is like, what is training these people to react this way? When you, on one end, gun rights are like are winning and they're ubiquitous, but then you have this person who's like, no, I would rather be nearly jobless and poor than work for your company. That's pretty extreme.
It's an
Right?
intense thing, but I mean, I don't know. Okay, I guess I'm thinking about this in the sense of like, I my question is, why the hell is she allowed to work in education? Like, you obviously aren't intelligent enough to be literate. So why are you working? Why are you working in education?
The crazy thing is that I truly, I totally viewed her as an intellectual that I could have conversations with.
Sure.
And I don't know, she started developing it in her head that I was like this like right wing, you know, extremist or whatever
Yeah,
she thought.
yeah.
The funny part is I'm sitting here as a college professor in like visual communications and design. I'm like, it was just, this job was so symbolic to her in how she viewed me that she couldn't get over it.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here like, working like all sorts of stuff. And, I've volunteered. I've worked at the Humane Society all the time. I did free work. I at one point taught inner city school children.
But you do
Like,
those things because you think it's right, not because somebody is pushing some sort of worldview on you. You think they're good things to
right.
do. They're things that you've pursued naturally and honestly, and it's something that she lacks entirely. She lacks intelligence and capacity, and so everything that she does is a stunt. And so it's like, the issue is that I think, and I've seen this happen before, but it is pretty astounding. Of like, oh, there's no longer anything that exists to Mike. You're just a troll for the gun culture.
Oh,
You
for
know
sure.
you know what I mean?
And
It's like,
there, and I have frequently, what's interesting to the OSD thing is that one of the key like kind of demographics we try to hit are these people that are on the fence. Like,
mhm.
there's my friend who hates me because I work at this company. She's all the way over here. There's like, Punisher skull, thin blue line sticker over here. And
Nope.
then there's these people that are in the middle that like don't know where to go. They don't want to go either direction.
Mhm.
And guns are unfortunately like in some ways, pushed all the way off to this right side when it didn't need to be. It could just be like this thing about being an empowered human being. And that's that demographic that we hit. There are more of those people on that fence than we realize, and there's more, from my own experience out there, gun culture does it a disservice in some ways because guns do become that thing that you identify with, and it's misleading. It's very misleading because, like, I know after I talk to somebody, hey, well, like, this guy doesn't identify as a Glock 19. This guy identifies as a person who just really loves the idea of freedom. I know that because we talked, and I can walk into that conversation and have it. Um, it's misleading because there's a group of people that don't. They're really loud, and that scares that gun owner because, like, the more ubiquitous you make it, like Palmetto State Armory, people might view their ARs as nonsense, but their company owner has said, it's like, my mission is to get as many AR-15s out into the public as humanly possible.
Mm-hmm.
And his whole goal for doing that was to make them to a number that was ungovernable.
Yep.
Right.
I mean, the Palmetto State Armory question is actually pretty easy. It's no one is. Let me rephrase this. It's not Palmetto State Armory's problem. It's the thing that people find unpalatable is the idea that somebody bought a $400 blem kit and it's just as good as your, it's just
for
as
sure.
good, right? That's what it is. That's really what it is. It's like, oh, this Palmetto State Armory gun that I bought is literally just as good as your, JP Armament Super or JP, or I'm sorry, JP Rifles, Super Comp 3 or whatever it is. I don't remember the names of their guns. But that's the point, is that, like, JP makes an extremely well-built extremely well-built carbine, or that is frequently used in competition because of its statistics. And it's a whole different beast than a Palmetto State Armory. And so, yes, the issue with to be very clear, the issue with Palmetto State Armory is not the company, it's the people who are like,
Oh
oh,
yeah,
it's just as good. It's not the people who work there. It's just as good. It's the guy it's the just as good guy, and
for sure.
I have met them in all walks of life. So it's not
No,
unique, but it's I think that's what it is.
but it's at that level of accessibility that we've hit, and then this like circles in so many ways to, like, most of the stuff we've talked about, is these, like, middle of the road people that now have access to firearms in a more comfortable way.
Mm-hmm.
They can order it and send it to a gun shop.
Mm-hmm.
They have access to a much more immense amount of information than they had before. Like T-Rex Arms I've heard him come up in other podcasts, and people, for good reason. Um, he's that presentation of information causes so many parallels to popular culture in video games, as well as the convenient display of information, creating like a hub that people can go to and buy everything that they need to do
Mm-hmm.
this thing. And I think that's why, like, the person that is mad at me for working at a holster company and won't accept a job there, I think that person is getting, like, edged out in so many ways, because I've brought very, like, liberal anti-gun friends to a gun range before, and I can tell you what, not a single one has ever sat there and gone, "Wow, going to the range was awful. I hated that so much. It was terrible." Dude, no one does that. They go to the range and they go, "Wow, that was like the best thing ever. That was so fun." And in some way walk away with an understanding of, like, okay, I get it on its basic level. I
Mm-hmm.
will never forget, like, one guy we took to a class, was like a Silicon Valley type guy. And the first class we ran him through, he kind of, like, sheepishly at the table goes, "Well, there has to be some sort of, like, gun control, right?" And a lot of people, like a couple of the people at the table, like, flipped around. There was the group that was on his side but didn't want to say it. There was another group that was like, "Dude, what is your problem? Like, I think I should own an RPG."
Can
And
you mail one to my house? You have an
yeah, can
RPG in
you
the
right? Like I should buy this in a vending machine.
Exactly.
And you know,
Borderlands all the
a lot.
way.
And we gave him a comfortable spot to land in that conversation and kind of guide him through that. I think 2 classes later, this guy had like 8 or 9 guns.
Yep.
8 or 9, and so the first class he worked at a big tech company. The first class, he was like, no, but not everyone should have one, right? And then the next one, by the time he had done it, and he's like, no, I get it entirely.
Mm-hmm.
It's a powerful thing, and I think the person that hates you for working at a holster company can also be brought into that. You can
Sure.
change their mind for sure. You just take them to a gun range once. Have you
There,
ever done that before?
have I done that before? Like taking
Yeah,
somebody
like
who's super against it to a gun range? I can't say that I have. I don't think that I have. I haven't. I'm trying to think of people that I know. I know that I have shot with people whose minds have been changed, but I can't think of any time where like I've had that I've deliberately gone like, "Oh, you don't like this? Let's go to the range." Um, and that might actually be a reflection of my own character. Like it's a good point because I maybe it's a something. It is. I'm rambling. You've caught me. You've got me. No, I have not. Where I've been in where I've tried to this is the only way this is going to come across is like a distraction, so I got to be careful on how I say it. But it's I have where I've ethically struggled with is knowing or having interactions with people who I don't think should own guns.
ooh, that's a
Because
hard one.
and that's where it's like, like it's there are certain people who have there are various people, very, 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 very few, where it's like, you know, I, I, I don't think you should, but I also recognize that you're a human being, so you have a right, and so my opinion on it is not the same as having authority over you on that subject. But examples would be, um, kind of the classic cases, but they're very small. I don't, like, but one of probably the clearest case of example that I have encountered was somebody that I knew who was an ideologue and a certain way of thinking where I was like, where it was a combination of, I would say, delusions, perhaps even delusions of grandeur, and so like but it's seriously ethically difficult to say
Oh yeah,
I don't think you should own guns. But there was, like, and this was like in 2020 in Minneapolis, and it's kind of I've kind of brought it up on the show a little bit, and again, it's one of those things where I'm kind of working through it in my own head because like it's kind of like orthodoxy within Christianity of like I know what the doctrine says, and so sometimes do you align yourself to the doctrine, or do you try to change the doctrine to aligning it to yourself? If I'm a Christian and I believe the Bible is inerrant, which means it's the actual word of God, which means it doesn't matter what I think it's true. Am I trying to align myself to the document? Am I trying to align myself to whatever is true, or am I trying to bend truth to whatever I want it to be? And so that's where I can see the conflict there. I can see that my gut would say you're the last person that I would want to own this.
are you giving yourself an out though on that? Because like I that's a hard that's a that topic can get you in a lot of trouble in this industry where people they want to take it so extremely, and they don't want to have that conversation because I know exactly the mental space. Like I don't have an answer for it either. I'm like
Hmm.
right alongside of you on it, and that the stopgap for me would probably be the same. You're the last person I'd want to have a gun. But I know in most people's heart of hearts that they know people who in their own head would say, I don't think they should have a gun. And it can be for all sorts of reasons. Like I know people who are not felons, who are legally allowed to own a gun, who are extremely angry people, like
Okay.
uncontrollable fits of rage. In theory, if I'm staying true to myself, I should say no. They can have a gun. I mean, that's the rule of law, and I believe that's a right for them.
Yeah.
In like my heart of hearts, I know them well enough to say like, well, dude, you probably shouldn't have one.
Yeah, so there's a good, I think there's a really good metaphor, not metaphor, but there's a lot of it's exactly contemporary. It's First Amendment, Second Amendment, freedom of speech, right to bear arms. Two places where these things overlap a lot in being, or exactly in our culture, where you brought it up earlier with the Substack article, which I still need to figure out which one it is. If I can figure it out before this one goes live, I'll try to put it in the notes below. I'll try to put it in the notes below if we can kind of chit chat back and forth and figure out who it is, because that would be a good one to include. And if I can remember the name of the philosopher who was talking about control, it was I think she was an Asian American gal. But let's address the concept of freedom of speech and right to bear arms in relevance to legality, morality, choices like that. One of the examples would be, let's take like the free speech problem. Okay, so I am not a free speech absolutist when it comes to the public. Oh, I just lost my. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. It's the computer, so it'll probably kick itself. But there you go. I'm
Oh,
back.
there you go.
As long as you can hear me, we're good. Because
I can hear you.
I don't know what it is. But let's take the free speech issue, right? And so I'm not a free speech absolutist when it comes to like certain parts of the public square. Clear in case examples are always going to be things like child pornography, right? That's a pretty easily divisive subject. And that's a very big problem that tech companies, I imagine, have dealt with, especially when they try to say they're the free speech platform or whatever, is that one of the first things that happens when you create a platform for communication that's pro free speech or a free speech whatever, the first thing that happens is people test that limit, right? And some of those people are trolls, and some of those people have ulterior motives, and some of those people are just having a good time and getting kicks, and some of those people are probably people that work for opposing companies, and so there's all of these issues, right? But that's a serious question when it comes to free speech. Yeah, sure, within the dictum of your own home, I think there's a certain amount of humility, recognizing that the idea that the apparatus necessary for a human organization referred to as a government to have control over what happens in your home is so much worse than the things that you could do in your home. A surveillance state is worse than people than a population with cretins in it. Having the government have a camera in your home and being able to monitor your daily life is actually worse than finding out that somebody in your neighborhood is a pedophile. Doesn't mean that you need to accept that they're active. I'm not just saying that like they're accused of it in the past, but
Right.
like active or participating. Like that is really bad. So is a surveillance state. So we're in this tension kind of thing. And so there are certain subjects that we would say that within the argument of free speech are, it's not really exceptions. It's just that it's not it's not just expression to do certain things. Not everything constitutes expression. And you working from an art background will have probably engaged with this idea quite a bit of like what constitutes genuine expression.
Oh, for
And
sure.
in the same vein, like the idea of people owning guns is like, we were talking about like the example of Malcolm Nance earlier, and like Malcolm Nance is an interesting character where I'm sure he's done something in his life that people find respectable, but after reading his most recent book, he is one of those people that I'd be concerned about because of what there are things written in that book that are so fantastical, I don't know if he wrote it. It's really hard to consider that somebody would write something like that, especially who's valued or observed as sort of an academic. But the same thing goes for Ibram X. Kendi or whatever his name is, Terrence or Lawrence or whatever, is like, these are characters I know who have political relevance on the left, and there are things that people have said in all different political outcomes. But the question being, if you believe this and you believe it to be true, wouldn't I not want you to own a gun? And that is also a different thing than saying, I think we should develop an apparatus that targets people like you, that limits.
And well, the hard part about that is if you were to really really simplify things, you wouldn't want your mortal enemy to have a gun. Well, your mortal enemy might not be a felon, um, and has probably equal rights to it, and you would never want to put your the person you disagree with on the same playing field as yourself if you were somebody who wanted to consistently win. That's a hard. I mean, and I know we're not approaching it like necessarily from that simplified of a standpoint, but
Mm-mm.
I like put it back to the idea that like you want the Nazi to be able to fly their flag in front of their house. And you don't want the city involved with deciding that the Nazi can't fly their flag, because if you let the city decide the Nazi can't have a swastika flag out in front of their house, well, if you let them decide that, they can obviously take down any flag they want. What society's response should be like, well, they're gonna go like kick that Nazi's ass, or they're not gonna invite him to. They're gonna bully him out of the neighborhood. And I sort of wonder like, is society capable of auto correcting itself in that like, okay, so you have a friend who has a terrible temper, they're extremely angry all the time, and they say, hey, I should get a gun, and you look at them and say, no, you really shouldn't get a gun. I don't think you should. In fact, I really really stand against it, to the point that like I'm going to try to prevent you from doing it. That's a weird place to be.
Mm-hmm.
I think realistically, society does have that obligation. I don't know if I don't think we have enough. Western society has strong enough family units to allow that to happen. But the gun community would get really pissed about you saying like, "Hey, some people shouldn't have this thing." But it's also like saying like, "I don't think a murderer should have a knife," right? Like, I don't
Okay,
know.
so are we able to kind of are we able to basically just rest on the laurel, or rest on the distinction between shouldn't versus illegal? Like, that's that, because I mean, that's the problem that I run in. That it's cold comfort is what it is. Like, the idea
Yeah.
that the idea that the state can choose who can and cannot is being wrong. Like, the existing in the tension between you shouldn't, however, the state should also not be allowed to make that decision, is a combination of a permanent tension and a cold comfort. It's cold. It's not very, like, oh well, I guess I live in tension. Meanwhile, this repressive tolerance, or whatever you want to use the words for these days. But
You're also saying like, okay, well, liberties have consequences, right? The
Mhm.
consequence is that somebody you don't like gets a gun. Are
Yeah.
you comfortable with that? Like, are you so uncompromising in your view of that liberty that you'll swallow the hard pill and say, hey, well, that guy gets a gun if he wants one. I can't stop it. Where are my boundaries on that? Because yeah, it's a confusing one. I mean, it's very like, you know people like to really put those things, have a lot of difficulty putting their money where their mouth is. I see it all the time, especially like right now with the pistol brace thing being banned. Um, a lot of people are gonna like, well, they'll either form one their gun, or they'll take their pistol brace off and leave it with just the receiver extent there, the tube. But you know, I think that ultimately you confront people with the realities. They bend different ways under that pressure, and
Mhm.
then it's that back to that what you're talking about is always being right on the internet. That need to be right. These conversations in some ways get diluted by that.
These conversations between you and I, or these conversations as a
No, like about this
conversation?
topic specifically,
Yes.
I think get really diluted because people aren't willing to spend an hour and 39 minutes talking about it when realistically they should. They should. You should have that conversation instead of like
I am going to
paring it down.
I'm going to disagree with you strongly. I think that conversations like this are happening much more often. They're just
Oh,
happening. I think they're just
yeah,
happening. They're happening between friends privately in their homes.
I would agree with you on that. I like. So what I'm saying is that we're almost approaching like the facade of what um we view from a bird's eye, I guess. I mean, I don't. It's funny because your mind almost wanders to like what the comments you see on Instagram, right?
Sure. I guess I don't spend a lot of time. I don't read comments on other people's posts. I mean, I do read the comments on our own occasionally, but it really depends on the platform and the
Yeah,
time of day. You know, like it's I'm not saying that I don't like some people use the comment section to reach out. We're also not really heavy in like as far as those who are listening to the show, my biggest interaction are actually usually private messages.
hmm,
I get more private messages than I get comments. Even like YouTube is a perfect example. Like I
mhm.
get less than one comment of video. And that of
What
course, but YouTube is our smallest platform. One of our smaller
what's your
platforms.
preferred platform, like as
Most
a user?
What do I prefer?
Yeah,
If I as I, I'm probably on YouTube all the time. I use it as a podcasting platform. Like I listen to people's shows on YouTube um a lot
interesting.
more than anything else. So I like so that's where it's like I'll have it playing in the background or I'll listen to it. Um I've used YouTube, but some of that is kind of like the audiences or who I'm listening to at the time. So there are some theologians that I'll listen to that are almost exclusively on podcasting platforms like Spotify and Apple, and I'll catch them. I'll catch them on those platforms, and then other things will come from YouTube, and so that's kind of. But I'd say the gross majority of what I listen to is on YouTube. The majority of what people listen to this show is on Spotify and other podcast platforms.
Yeah,
Which is not a it
that's
would that community is not built on interaction. It's built on, it's not like people are commenting on Spotify. Um, I do appreciate that people take time to like, give me a 5-star review or thumbs it up, but if I'm
I
my communication is almost entirely through Instagram DMs.
yeah, and you know what? It's that catches me off guard constantly, um, because it's really easy for us to because of how fast-paced things are, it's very easy for us to treat it on its surface, but most of the interactions, like, I am constantly shocked that if I'm on the Ferro Concepts Instagram, it has, like, 200,000 followers, and I'm shocked at the things people DM that account all the time because I think, like, you're I always come from this assumption that like people don't care because they're on the other end of a device. I always hit it from that assumption, and then like when people reach out and want to discuss things like in greater detail, I'm always like I have this gut reaction of like, oh wow, like you want to talk? That's amazing. It's kind of funny because I'm proven constantly wrong about that
Mhm.
all the time because like I said, I just assume people have nothing to say, and then they speak up, and I'm like, "Oh, whoa!" Like daily, I think that happens. Even on my own personal Instagram, I'm like, "What the heck?" Come out of the blue here.
Hmm. Yeah,
It's
I
kind
mean,
of funny.
we're as far as like Instagram goes, and in the grand scheme of gun culture, like we're a pretty small page. We're also new in the also in the timeline, but there is I don't know, like I'm curious if that will change as we continue to be on our trajectory. Like I hope not, but I also think that a lot of gun culture is looking for continuously looking for ways to have like genuine conversation with each other. And
Oh yeah,
it's not it's not easy, but some people are figuring it out and some people are not. And
We
it's sad, but it's true.
Open Source Defense opened up a Discord server.
Hmm.
I think we have like something like 4,000 followers on Instagram, and like our email list is like a nice size. We opened up that Discord server, and like over 500 people joined it. You were 100% correct in that. Like, people are looking for those conversations, and it's shocking all the time because you assume people don't care, or maybe it's because you just don't know them. But
Hmm.
we were like flabbergasted about it. 500 people just show up onto a Discord server. It was actually a huge problem because we had no idea how to moderate it because we thought 20 people were going to show up.
It's true. Yeah, that'll happen.
Do you have a Discord server? Does
We have not.
Redacted?
Redacted has not started a Discord server yet. I think that's in the that's definitely like on the potential drawing board. Um, there's a certain element like we're not unique in doing this, but what I'm trying to do is um, I'm not unique in this problem, but the concern and the ability to do this is that I want to make sure that as we continue to expand options, it's not something that becomes a runaway train. Like I want to be able to add an element and not add. It's not about control. It's that like it's not about control in the sense that I want to have control over it. It's um admittedly, even within like gun culture trends, I haven't been the fastest mover. I was kind of slow on the red dot pistols uptake. I was a little slow on some other subjects, like, and so I'm not the fastest. But also I've come to understand where my place is in some ways is that when it comes to gun culture as a whole, the thing that I'm singly most interested in and convicted by is really how we think about violence, how we think about ethics and philosophy, which is not a surprise for people who know who I am. And so when it comes to the Discord server, it's on the drawing board as in like, that wouldn't be a bad idea, but I need to make sure that I have my, let's just say my metaphysic together before I get started on that. Um, that being the case, it's probably something like that is gonna to happen here. We've talked about opening up. Yeah, I guess in the introduction we're talking a little bit about doing like a subscribe star thing. I'm figuring things out like how do I make sure all of my bills are paid? How are all expenses covered? This has become very much so a full-time thing. And so I've been having to choose between like, well, I can't do all the platforms. I don't want to have a Patreon and a subscribe star and a locals and just keep going down the list of all the things to do. Because the main concern that I'm going to run into on even from being this side of the camera is um I can't lose. If I lose grasp, not like control, but grasp on the thing, it doesn't matter. Like
Yeah, you should consider um, using Substack.
Substack.
Yeah, because like if especially if writing is a big deal for you,
Mm-hmm.
Substack is gonna um, allow people. It basically, I mean, the part that sucks about it is that you're kind of like paywalling people,
Mm.
but I don't think that that's wrong, right? If you know, it's like you're not entitled to it, right? So charge people for these things. Obviously, like your podcast can be your thing, and then that people have access to that information. But the writings on some of these topics could be done through something like Substack, and I think people should pay to read that.
Okay.
I just an idea.
I mean, it's an idea. So, have you been using Substack for a while?
Open Source Defense uses Substack. I have subscribed to a few different
Okay.
writers. The convenience of it is that it ends up in my inbox. And if you're a working professional, odds are you have an inbox that you receive company alerts from, whether you're whatever job you're doing.
Hmm.
It's nice to have those writings mixed into that.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, because I do. I mean, the books behind me, I do write. And that is it. That is it. I mean, I guess let's not bog down too much of the show because I do appreciate that influence because it has been a serious question of like, how much writing goes into everything, and that is one thing that I guess I think many of us take for granted, and that is true. I wanted to hear your thoughts on, but let's talk about like the idea of like, the kind of we can wrap this up together perhaps on one sort of connection of points being you said there's a certain amount of things should be paid for, right? So like we live in the social media age and we live in the digital age and we live, there's free content, there's paid for content, there's some things that you can get for free, some things that you can't. You were talking about it earlier. A lot of gun culture is like aesthetic, is sort of driven by this DIY mentality as opposed to something else. And so even when it comes to, let's take photography as an example, as we're going to use it as a boat and a delivery vehicle for this idea because I want to hear, you have experience on both ends. Photography, I can imagine you've observed in the last 2 decades, and I don't think you've been in professionally in photography for that long, but um being able to use retrospect or look back in history,
for sure.
photography has become a hobby for many people, something in between a hobby and a profession for some people. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
So like, the ability for an average, this is gonna people from Minnesota are gonna get the joke, and an average Edina white girl to get a DSLR camera and become a photographer is like, it doesn't cost anything. Um, and it's a joke, but the point being said is that like you don't have to go to school to be a photographer, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to go to school to be a philosopher either. You don't have to go to school to be a writer. Does it help? Maybe, maybe now, depending on the school and the efforts put in. Maybe. Um, how do you see that same dynamic playing out in gun culture?
Yeah, I mean, I one of the things I used to do in the beginning of a lot of my classes, I would talk to students that like your cousin Jimmy has a DSLR. Um, he can go out and take a bunch of photos and print them off. How are you different than him? You can relate that into guns in that, well, you can go down to a gun shop, and get yourself a Glock 19, um, go shoot it on the weekend. How are you different than that person that just does that and they're it's their hobby or it's their casual or they put it in a drawer and never put it away. Um, that is always really interesting to me because guns are more accessible than they've ever been, and we were getting back in that conversation of like craftsmanship, where you're going out and teaching yourself almost like life lessons by yourself at a gun range. There's a ton of power in that, to where you go out and take this firearm, um, and you hold yourself accountable every single drill that you do. There's a lot of things in our day to day that are the opposite of that, and want to break us down into more simplified beings. I think that's like how you separate yourself from like, in that grand scheme of like accessibility. I always felt like photography being the most accessible art made it harder in many ways because there was a good photographer on every street corner, just like there's a good fast pistol shooter on every Instagram page. I could find a million of them right now, right? There's a ton of people that are good at it. And what kind of separates you, in in that community that is really exceptionally accessible, because a Glock is $500 and a box of ammo is $25, and now you're a shooter. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does. I think so. It does, in the sense of like, it's a difficult question. I've brought this up before on the show. I brought it up before on the show, and I'll have to continue it until I can find it an easy, or not an easy, but a solution that, I think is solvent enough. But it kind of comes back down to the what for. The gun culture, especially on the citizen side, is constantly undergoing a bit of an identity crisis, not in the Descartesian sense, but in a little bit more of the postmodern sense of asking the question, what for? It's a bit more of an existential crisis. These are fancy words that people use all the time to try to sound smart, myself included. So I now exist within the guilty. Shame on me. But
So do I.
But and what I'm trying to say with there is, it is a hard question to answer. It's a very hard question to answer, because no answer is just as unsatisfactory as a half-ass answer. No answer and like the I don't know of it can only last for so long before it drives you mad. And so they're like, is there a hierarchy? How do we set values, and how are we setting positions on it? And the closest thing that I can get to an answer on that one is that the thing that puts people truly in gun culture, that separates people within gun culture, the thing that truly, truly separates people in gun culture is character, moral character, and dedication to values. Everyone can state that they have values. Everyone can state that they have some sort of, they're committed to the cause. Everyone can state that they're here for the long haul. They believe in the purpose. Everyone can state that they're here for the mission. That they believe in rights. Anyone can say that. Talk is cheap. Criticism of people is also cheap. It's the internet. You calling somebody a shill does nothing. It does not accomplish anything. I guarantee you. You're building your identity on something being dumb. And your conscience will be able to tell you between something, building your identity on a false foundation will collapse underneath you, either when you need to have it right. This is what we saw in the military, or we see in different scenarios. Cowards get found out. Stolen valor gets found out. It comes out. And it comes out some ways that are extremely overt. Like, you get found out that you're lying about your resume. And then suddenly the false foundation, the lie that you've built your entire platform on, collapses underneath you. And the collapse is more spectacular than the rise. That the reason why you're famous is not because you did something, not because of what you claimed, but because of how spectacular the crash is. Jack Murphy is more famous because of how he collapsed than how he rose to prominence. And Jack Murphy, if you know who that is, he was some masculinity guy that was a guest on Tim Pool's show for a while. And the reason why I bring that up is because, like, I've been a guest on Tim Pool's show. He doesn't owe me anything. He's great. He's doing his own thing. So that's kind of how I got into podcasting. So if anyone from his crew's listening, thanks for the influence. But so the point in that one is like, I think the separation between peoples and the separations within gun culture comes from values and character, where it's really, that's like a really high stakes game. The cost of entry is not, do you have a Knight's Armament SR-15? Yeah, sure, we make jokes about different tier levels and poverty tier and stuff like that. The real question that we're trying to figure out is, are these people honest? Are they true? And that's a big, it's a high bar. Not that honesty is a high bar, but like, There I am. Am I still
Yeah,
audible?
you're still audible. The interesting part to me, and we kind of brush on it a little bit, is that like that's becoming more common. Um, People being rooted out, and the bar is getting higher, where people are asking more questions. It's not so much of like, okay, well, I believe in the Second Amendment. Well, oh, that's great, but like, what else? And you're seeing like more in-depth content that is covering larger, broader spectrums of life than just guns, right? And I think it's great. I like the direction that it's going, and the content that I'm seeing, instead of just these pages that were filled of like my own personal Instagram page is like just mindless photos of guns, right? And that's like it's stupid. Like no one who cares about that. What I want to see about is like how do you be a better man? How do you be a better husband? How do you be a better employee? How do you be a better business owner? And all those questions are happening. And the coolest, weirdest thing to me is that it started with like gun culture. And that's where we're led to.
Mhm.
I like it. I'm very happy with some of those things that I'm seeing for sure.
I am optimistic as well. I think that the the door to entry is open, as in like there isn't a, despite what people may say, there is not the prejudice. There may be suspicion, right? There may be suspicion, and perhaps, my the gravest concern I have about the brace ruling is that it will continue. It will sow demoralization amongst the population.
Oh,
That that that
entirely
that
possible.
that's a concern, and so I that it'll so just it just
It feels
just
overbearing. It feels like too big of a monster to tackle,
no,
right?
it's the no no the classic example is that I don't like you, Mike, and you're in a business and I want to sabotage you, so I'm going to call the ATF and say he's got illegal guns.
I see. I see. I
Right?
see. I
Or
see.
you and
Yeah.
I are in business
Mhm.
together and it takes a bad turn. And so I decide I get drunk one night and I screw you over. I'm going to get back at that guy, that kind of stuff. Or or my friend, I don't think my friend, I don't trust that my friend will hold out. And so now I don't know how to treat him, kind of thing. These are I'm not talking about entry level concerns. I'm not talking about, is the ATF confiscation. What worries me is that saboteurs, and then what I mean by saboteurs is people who are our friends will stab each other in the back because now they have a new avenue of approach. And it's like, but at the same time, then we'll know who the snakes are. So
You
fine.
will.
But those are the things that, like, and they're personal. That's probably how I can say it. They're personal. They're probably more emotional concerns than intellectual concerns.
It's a reasonable suspicion for sure. Like it's a reasonable, not suspicion. It's a reasonable thought to have, like to be worried about that. It's
Yeah, like
concerning.
it's sort of like the great tragedy of the end coming in a whimper, not in a bang. Right? It's almost it's. I mean, I get it. There's a big Viking thing going on. The trend is starting to wane, but it's like, no one wants that. No one wants their last moments to be cowardice or just or
Yeah,
pathetic collapse. And it's like, yeah, a life worth lived is not necessarily one that goes out spectacularly but doesn't end in a whimper.
yeah. I would
So
have to agree.
like when it comes to gun culture, it's, I don't want to see the end. I just, it would be like, you're have you ever read the book Great Expectations by Charles Dickens?
Yes.
I read it. I supposedly read it when I was a kid, so I don't really remember the story. But the only thing that I remember from it is this idea that this kid is basically opened up an opportunity to some form of, you know, in the framework of the story, greatness, and ends up none of it happens. Nothing happens. It just goes right back to the trash. And like that is sort of that is probably the closest thing to emotional terror that it comes to. Like
Yeah.
you know, seeing whether it's people that you know who like he had that it when I was in the military, there was this phrase that something that was told to me by a guy, and it was a squad leader who said this to me. And he says, you know, you have great potential. And we were young. We were young. So there's wisdom to be gained from it. But it was like, I don't know if he understood how insulting that was. You have great potential. Yeah, but I'm not. But obviously, that implies that I'm not living up to it. And
Yeah.
and part of that was insulting because it was like there were other issues. It wasn't like I was insulted. Like it was just like there are things that had to be learned, right? We had to learn how to work together as a
Hmm.
squad, and there are things that we had to learn to work together as a team, and there were things that did work out and things that didn't work out, and all these other kind of things. But it was interesting to hear, you bastard, you know, like thanks. You know, how about you help me figure that potential out? And sometimes they can, and sometimes they can't. So,
Yeah.
well, let's call this conversation. Let's wrap it up for today because I want to go on. I want to there are things that I want to sit down and think about. I want to have another conversation with you, but I feel like, you know, this arc has kind of come to a pretty decent conclusion unless you have a little more you want to add.
No, I am still just like I'm enamored by the you just you start somewhere and you don't know somebody very well. Like it's the first time I'm really meeting you, and you just can talk for 2 hours straight. Right? It's pretty fun. I very much enjoy it. It's cool.
Yeah. I'm thankful that you came on the show, man. I'm genuinely thankful in the sense of, like I think I know it came up somewhere in the show, but these are the conversations that I think are happening in our culture. And
I think
sometimes,
so.
and quite frankly, sometimes we just don't know how to have them. And so, you know, we either stumble. This is very Jordan Peterson esque, but we either stumble uphill trying, or we sink into the mire. And it's the same thing with gun culture and learning how to shoot. You're either genuinely trying to learn how to shoot, or you're kind of sinking into something worse than complacency. So
Yeah.
and part of shooting is identifying what you're aiming at, and some of that it happens on the target stand, and some of that is, what am I thinking about next week and focusing on tomorrow, and what about how am I being deliberate with my friendships and my conversations. So I do appreciate you coming on here. I'd like to sit down and have a talk with you about photography and art and the aesthetic of gun culture. That would be a
Yeah. We
conversation that would be really fun to have on how not everything is three doors down in ACU anymore.
yeah, we should do that.
Okay,
Be fun.
let's look at the
Yeah.
calendar. But is there anything that where can people find you? What do you want to leave the crowd with? If you have to do Garand Thumb flannel daddy advice, you can, but I wouldn't. You know, it's a little bit of a trend. What
No, no. I don't want to do that. You can just opensourcedefense.org is where you can get some information. And then obviously I don't really have to plug Ferro Concepts, but I think the content looks great. So I'm very proud of that. Buy plate carriers because we need your money to live.
Well, every time that I've been to the Ferro booth at SHOT Show, the Canadian roots of some of your staff come out because they're so
Oh, for sure.
wonderful people. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
good people to talk to. So I really do appreciate meeting you a little bit more personally over the time. So thank you very much for coming on, Mike. And yeah, I mean, open source defense is a good thing to check out. I've seen some of your, I've looked, skimmed through like the front pages a little bit. Definitely skimming. And I look forward to having another conversation with you about this. So
Awesome.
well, there you go. Well, in closing, it has been the Redacted Culture Cast. If you're still listening, we appreciate your time. I'm thankful for what you guys have provided for us. As of now, be prepared to follow us on Instagram and watch the website for updates on the pre-order for the Redacted X Orion Training Group skate deck, which can be used as wall art. It can be used beneath your feet as a board, but that will be put together, so far as we understand, by Raid Skateboards. We are working on the design has been done. We should be getting one in our hands soon. However, in all intents and purposes, it's a green light go. Green light go meaning but the proceeds of which will be going to the Firearms Policy Coalition to as a part of helping out what we can do to play our part with functioning as a community to basically argue for our values. If you want to support the show, unless things have changed, the only way that you can support the show is through redactedllc.com. That is where you're going to be finding our merch. I know that I have set up a locals page. I think there's a donate thing through there, but I'm not pressuring you into that at all because we have not moved or taken on locals, but we are trying to set up a subscribe star. And if they've approved us at this time, maybe that's an option. That'd be subscribestar.com/redacted. That is how we keep the lights on. That's how we keep these shows rolling. In conclusion, Mike, thanks for coming on here. I look forward to having a conversation with you again in the future. So that's all.
Awesome.